Frost covered the windshield the morning I found the auction notice stuffed between two grocery store flyers. And for a full minute, I genuinely thought it belonged to a neighbor, that our mail carrier had simply made a mistake, because the address printed at the top of that letter was mine, and the property listed for sale in 60 days was 140 acres I'd spent 11 years of my life working. Welcome back to Silent Mirror Stories, where hidden truths finally find their reflection, and quiet people discover that silence often protects the strongest evidence. Somebody out there has watched a family member smile at your table while quietly dismantling your entire life behind your back. And if that's you, stay with me, because what I found buried in 3 years of paperwork my sister-in-law never expected anyone to actually read carefully is going to make you want to check your own mailbox a little more closely. My name is Kristen Bauer, and I was 32 the year my husband's family farm nearly disappeared out from under me, sold at auction to strangers because of a decision I never made and never signed off on, dressed up, at the time, as something as boring and forgettable as a tax strategy. Lincoln, Nebraska raised me, the daughter of a mechanic and a school nurse, and nothing about that childhood had anything to do with farming. Corn rows and irrigation schedules weren't language I spoke natively. Grease under my father's fingernails and the specific hush of a hospital ward where my mother worked nights, that was my early world, tidy and urban compared to what waited for me later. 24 years old at a friend's wedding reception, I met Dale Bauer standing near a punch bowl looking distinctly uncomfortable in a rented suit. And within a year of dating him, I'd fallen in love not just with the man, but with the specific rhythm of the farm his family had worked outside Grand Island for 4 generations. The sunrise chores, the smell of the barn in October, the particular satisfaction of watching a harvest come in after a season of worry over rain. Walter and Ruth still lived on the property when we married, in the original farmhouse, while Dale and I built a smaller home about a quarter mile down the same gravel road, close enough to hear the dogs bark at night from either house. Walter had been slowing down for years by then, arthritis making the physical work nearly impossible, and it was understood, quietly and without much formal discussion, that Dale would eventually take over the operation entirely, the way his own father had taken it over from his grandfather 2 generations earlier. Pamela, Dale's older sister, moved to Omaha at 18 and built a career there in commercial insurance, and from everything I understood at the time, that career was going reasonably well. She drove weddings and graduations into her life a few times a year, mostly holidays, always arriving with expensive wine and leaving before the dishes were done, and I never had any particular reason to think of her as anything other than a slightly distant but perfectly pleasant sister-in-law. Dinner conversations at the farmhouse used to circle around weather and grain prices, the price of diesel, whether the neighbor's cattle had gotten loose again. That shifted, gradually and then not so gradually, after Walter's stroke. He survived it, thankfully, mobility limited afterward, but his mind, in most everyday interactions, seemed largely intact, at least to those of us who saw him weekly rather than professionally. A specific vulnerability opened up in him that Pamela seemed to notice before any of the rest of us fully processed it ourselves. A softness around decision-making that hadn't existed before. A willingness to defer that felt, in hindsight, like exactly the kind of change a predator watches for. Her visits multiplied after that. Words like estate planning and protecting the family legacy started appearing at a dinner table that had never once discussed either concept in any formal way across 4 decades. One particular evening stands out clearly, maybe 8 months after the stroke, Pamela arriving with a manila folder thick enough to require a rubber band, laying it open across the kitchen table with the careful, patient tone of someone who assumed nobody else in the room understood finance as well as she did. Transferring the farm's title into an LLC, with her named as managing member, temporarily, just for liability protection, would save the family a significant amount in eventual estate taxes, she explained, tapping specific numbers on a printed spreadsheet like they were self-evident proof. Trust ran deep between Dale and his sister, deeper than I fully appreciated until much later. He'd grown up believing she was the smart one, the one who understood money and paperwork the way he understood soil composition and equipment maintenance. And when she laid out charts and projected savings, he nodded along the way you nod along with a doctor explaining a diagnosis you don't have the vocabulary to challenge. Questions came out of me that night, plenty of them, and I want to be specific about that, because later, once everything unraveled, there was a version of events my own mother-in-law tried to construct in which I'd simply gone along with everything silently. That wasn't true. Why did the LLC need Pamela as the sole managing member rather than Dale, or both of them jointly, or Walter himself while he was still capable of managing his own affairs? I asked, more than once, in more than one way. Answers came easily to her, every single time. Omaha put her closer to the attorneys and accountants who could handle the paperwork efficiently, she said. Business travel meant she could liaise with tax professionals during business hours in a way that Dale, tied to the farm's daily schedule, genuinely couldn't manage himself. Every objection I raised got smoothed over with a reasonable-sounding explanation, layered one on top of another until the whole thing sounded, if you weren't listening too carefully, like simple, sensible planning. Eventually, I stopped raising them, partly because I was outnumbered at that table, 3 against 1 on most evenings once Ruth started nodding along too, and partly because I told myself this was Dale's family's business more than mine, a decision I've replayed more times than I can count since, turning it over looking for the exact moment I should have dug in harder and didn't. March brought the actual signing, a Tuesday afternoon with sunlight slanting through the farmhouse's kitchen window at a low winter angle. Walter's hand shook holding the pen, the stroke having left a permanent tremor that made his signature look almost like a child's careful attempt at cursive. And I remember watching that signature form letter by letter and feeling something uneasy settle into my stomach that I couldn't fully name or justify at the time, something that felt less like suspicion and more like a held breath. Nothing dramatic followed immediately. Life simply went on. Dale kept running the operation exactly as he always had, planting, harvesting, maintaining equipment, paying for seed and fuel and repairs out of the farm's operating account. An account that, as it turned out, Pamela had also quietly restructured during that same period, adding herself as a signatory while removing Dale's name from certain administrative permissions. A change buried inside routine paperwork none of us thought to scrutinize line by line. Tucked between insurance renewal forms and tax filing acknowledgments that looked, on the surface, like exactly what they were supposed to be. 2 years after his stroke, Walter passed peacefully in his sleep, and Ruth followed less than a year later, her own health declining steadily once she lost him, grief settling into her chest like water into low ground. Both funerals blur together somewhat in my memory now. The same church, the same casseroles arriving on the same kitchen counter, Pamela standing beside Dale at each graveside, her hand on his shoulder, playing the role of grieving, supportive sister with a specific, practiced grace that, at the time, I read as genuine. 14 months after Ruth's funeral, that auction notice arrived. 60 days, the letter said, printed in a font stark enough to make the number feel like a countdown. Non-payment of a commercial loan secured against the property, it explained. A lender none of us had ever heard of. A loan amount that made my hands shake reading it standing there at the mailbox in my slippers. A due date that had apparently already passed months earlier, quietly, without either Dale or me ever receiving a single payment notice or default warning at our own address. Dale was out at the equipment shed that morning, replacing a hydraulic hose on the tractor, and I called him standing in the frost-covered driveway, reading the letter over the phone word for word. Silence lasted on the other end long enough that I asked twice if he was still there, his breath audible but nothing else, no words, just the specific quality of a man's mind trying to make sense of something that refused to add up. We drove to Omaha that same week, sat across from Pamela at a coffee shop near her office, the kind of place with exposed brick and $8 lattes, and asked her directly what a $140,000 commercial loan had to do with a farm that had never carried any significant debt in 4 generations. Her explanation shifted 3 times over the course of that single conversation, each version slightly more elaborate than the last as the previous one failed to hold together under our questions. First, she said it must be some kind of clerical error at the bank, a mix-up, easily fixed. Then, once Dale pressed harder, she said she'd taken out a modest loan against the LLC's assets to cover some business expenses she'd expected to repay quickly before things got complicated. By the time we pushed for actual documentation, demanding she pull it up on her own phone right there at the table, she admitted, with a specific coldness I'd never seen from her before, a flatness in her voice that erased every trace of the warm sister-in-law who'd sat at our kitchen table for over a decade, that she'd used the property as collateral for a business venture of her own that had failed, and that the loan had gone into default months earlier without her ever mentioning it to either of us. Dale asked her, point blank, hands flat on the table like he needed something solid to hold on to, how she could do this to their own parents' legacy. She told him, and I remember this word for word because it's burned into my memory permanently, replaying at odd hours for months afterward, that the farm had never really been his to begin with, not on paper, and that she'd simply been managing an asset that legally belonged to her. Something in me went very cold and very focused in that coffee shop, a specific clarity replacing the shock I'd been carrying for days, the kind of clarity that arrives right after grief burns itself out and leaves something harder and more useful behind it. An attorney got hired within the week, a careful woman in Grand Island named Beverly Ose, who specialized in agricultural property disputes, someone a neighbor had recommended after a similar, though far smaller, dispute over shared irrigation rights years earlier. Beverly started pulling every piece of paperwork associated with that LLC from the moment it was created, requesting bank records, county filings, notary logs, anything with a date stamp attached to it. Nearly a month it took her to fully compile what she found, and the picture that emerged was considerably more deliberate than a single failed business venture gone wrong. Pamela had, in the 2.5 years since taking control of that LLC, used the property as collateral not once but 3 separate times, each loan slightly larger than the last, each one apparently going toward personal debts, including, Beverly's investigation eventually confirmed, a considerable amount of credit card debt and a failed real estate investment in Omaha that had cost Pamela nearly all her personal savings before she ever touched the farm's collateral at all. Walter's signature on that original LLC document became the center of everything once Beverly examined it closely alongside medical records from around the same period, records that took a separate, more formal request to obtain given privacy protections that technically outlived him. His neurologist's notes, once they finally arrived in a thick manila envelope, documented significant post-stroke cognitive impairment during the exact window that document was signed, specific language about diminished executive function, and impaired capacity for complex financial reasoning that raised serious, legally significant questions about whether Walter had genuinely understood what he was agreeing to at all that March afternoon. An emergency injunction became the immediate priority, filed by Beverly within days to halt the auction while the fraud investigation proceeded, and the judge granted it after a single brief hearing, buying us the time we desperately needed, though I remember sitting in that courtroom hallway afterwards shaking with a relief so total it felt almost like nausea. Numbers told the rest of the story once a forensic accountant got involved, tracing every dollar of those 3 loans, building a paper trail that made Pamela's actual intentions impossible to argue around. Bank records showed the loan proceeds moving directly into Pamela's personal accounts, paying off her own credit cards, funding a lifestyle in Omaha that had apparently outpaced her actual insurance salary for years, a lease on a car she couldn't otherwise afford, a downtown condo with monthly payments that made no sense against her documented income. County prosecutors got involved once Beverly formally presented the evidence, thick binders of documentation laid out across a conference table like something from a television courtroom drama, and Pamela was charged with elder financial exploitation and fraud roughly 4 months after that coffee shop conversation. Charges tied specifically to using Walter's diminished cognitive capacity to secure control over an asset worth considerably more than she'd ever disclosed to anyone in the family. For the better part of a year, Dale didn't speak to his sister at all. Not a phone call, not a text, nothing beyond what the legal proceedings themselves required. I watched him carry a specific grief through that period that had nothing to do with losing the farm and everything to do with understanding exactly what his sister had been willing to do to their own father. A grief that sat differently than anything I'd seen from him, even at his parents' funerals. Quieter, angrier, the kind that showed up in how long he'd stand at the kitchen window before coming to bed. Voided entirely, that's what the court eventually ruled regarding the LLC transfer, citing both the fraud and Walter's documented incapacity at the time of signing, restoring full ownership of the property directly to Dale as the named heir under Walter's original will. A document, thankfully, that had never been altered, sitting untouched in Beverly's own files the entire time, a fact that felt, once we learned it, like the single piece of luck in this entire ordeal. Roughly 8 months into the case, Pamela pled guilty to reduced charges, avoiding a trial in exchange for restitution and a suspended sentence with probation. Restitution barely made a dent in the actual damage, financial or otherwise. The money long since spent on debts and a lifestyle that had already collapsed around her by that point. But Beverly told us it was, realistically, the best outcome available given how thoroughly Pamela had already spent the money. Nothing left to actually seize or recover beyond what the court ordered. Fully, cleanly, the farm belongs to us now, title restored and recorded properly at the county office. A fact I still find myself double-checking online every few months. Some part of me still half expecting to find another surprise notice waiting in the mailbox some frosty morning. Twice, Dale and Pamela have spoken since the case concluded, both times brief, both times at family events neither of them could reasonably skip, a cousin's wedding, a mutual aunt's funeral. No relationship left to repair, not really, just two people who happen to share parents who aren't alive anymore to referee whatever this has become. Autumn brought the first harvest we ran entirely free of that lingering dread, the specific fear that had colored every season since the auction notice arrived, wondering if some new document might surface, some new debt we hadn't discovered yet. Watching the combine move through those rows that October, I found myself thinking less about Pamela and more about Walter, about that shaking signature, about how completely someone can weaponize a person's love and trust against the very family that person spent their whole life building. I think about that frosty morning sometimes, standing at the mailbox holding a letter that made no sense at first glance, and I understand now that it was, in its own strange way, the thing that finally forced 3 years of quiet manipulation into daylight where it couldn't survive another season. Some mistakes don't announce themselves. Some fraud runs quietly for years, wearing the specific, comfortable disguise of family trust, right up until a piece of paper with the wrong address on it forces everyone to actually look. My sister-in-law spent 3 years convincing an entire family that handing her legal control of their farm was simple, boring paperwork, certain that nobody would ever look closely enough to trace where the money had actually gone. What she never counted on was a single auction notice, delivered to the wrong mailbox by nobody's mistake, but her own miscalculation, unraveling 3 years of quiet theft in front of the exact family she'd spent that entire time convincing to trust her completely. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Silent Mirror Stories, where every reflection reveals another hidden truth. Tell me in the comments, would you have pushed back on that LLC paperwork the moment it landed on the table, or did something similar happen in your own family before anyone realized what was actually going on?